So back in our application, this is where we last left it, I'll add a new container. I'll add in the containers folder and I'll name it Auth. You can of course name this whatever you want. And there I'll create the auth.js file, and this will be this page I want to load with the sign up or sign in form. Now in here, I will create a class-based component. So I'll import React and component from React. It's been a time since we created such a component, but I'm sure you still know how it works. We create it with the class keyword, then the name of the component like auth, and we extend this component we're importing. And there we need a render method where we return some JSX, and in the end I'll export this class as the file default. Now the JSX here will be pretty close to our contact data form. I'll have a wrapping div, and in there I'll add a form element. And in this form element I want to use my custom input and button components, just as I use them in the contact data component or container. I'll also manage my form through the state of this auth container, not through Redux, because I'm only talking about the local state, the values the user entered into the form inputs and so on. And it makes more sense to me to use them and to manage them inside the container with React's state property. So I'll add state here, and I'll add a controls property, and I'll set it up kind of equally to the contact data so that I can reuse the logic from there. There we had a order form property, and then we had the various controls, and they all had something like the element type, config, and so on. I'm going to copy the name control from there and put it into my auth controls object and rename it from name to email. Now the element type will still be an input element. The config, here I will create an input element of type email, and the placeholder should just be mail address, for example. Now the value initially is empty. Regarding the rules, I want to reuse the check validity method from contact data, and there I support things like required min length, max length, is email, is numeric, and that is basically what I want to introduce in the auth container too. So I have required, and now I also want to set up is email to true for this email control I'm creating here. Valid initially should be false, and touched is also false. And now I will duplicate this once to also have a password field. So here I'll add password like this. It will also be of type input, but then the element type will be of that. The type of the input itself then will be a password, and the placeholder will therefore be password. It should be required, and let's say we want to have a min length of 7 characters or 6 characters maybe. That actually is the min length required by Firebase. Of course, adjust this to your backend. With that, we got this set up. We can now dynamically create that form. And for that, I first of all need to import the input and button component. So my own components there. Input from, now I need to move up into the components folder, into the UI folder. Then there the input folder with the input file, and the same for the button component like this. Now the logic is the same as in the contact data component. There we also looped through all our controls here, and I can therefore copy the code from there where I converted my state object to an array I can loop through. I'll copy that. I'll then move over to the auth container and add that in the render method before I return anything. And now I want to loop through it and create my form. So I'll create a new constant which I'll name form. And there I want to take my form elements array, call map to map it into an array of JSX elements. I get each form element here, and I will return JSX. I want to return my input. It's a self-closing element, and it takes a lot of keys and properties. The first one is the key property. There, I really just want to use the form element ID, which is available since I added here. If you remember the forms module, we added it here. It's the name of the element to be precise. And then all the other keys which are expected. We can have a look at the contact data, and we can actually copy all the setup from there for all the other props we set up on the input element and add it here in the auth container. So there we can also leave the code as it is because I kept the name. I'm talking about a form element in my loop, and I do use that here too. I do have a config key and a value key and all these keys because I use the same setup in my state property, so that's really reusable. And with that, we now have a dynamically generated set of inputs. Now the next thing is of course that I also need a button. So below all these inputs, I'll add a button. That button requires a button type prop, which I'll set to success. Danger would be the other option we have in our application. And that should not be part of my form here though. That should be part of my form element down there where I return something. And above the button, I'll render this form constant, which contains my inputs. With that, the button should not be a self-closing element, but the button should allow me to add some caption in between the tags. So here I'll simply say submit. And now we got a form with inputs and a button. To see it, we need to load it via routing. We got the auth container and we set up all our routes in the app.js file. So there I want to import my auth container, import auth, from /containers auth and auth again. And now here I'll simply replicate one of the routes, and let's say for /auth I want to load this auth component like that. Let's try this out, and to be able to reach that, I'll also go into my components folder and there to navigation items, into the navigation items component. Here we got our links, and I will add a new one. I will add a link to /auth, and I'll give it a caption of authenticate, something like that. With that set up, let's go back to the application. We are on authenticate. The styling is a bit off though, and if we inspect it, I can't spot my inputs. So let's head back to the auth container and see where the inputs are at. We have a form, that should be that form constant, but somehow when looping through the array here, we seem to not really create inputs. The reason is because I copied the code from contact data. I'm referring to an order form property in my state, but here in the auth container, I renamed this to controls. So I'll just rename it here too. And now if we go back, we see the controls. Now to also give this some styling, I'll add a auth.css file, and I'll copy the styling from the contact data CSS file into there, replace the contact data class here with the auth class, and leave all the styling. And in the auth.js file, I'll then import my classes from the ./auth CSS file, and then assign it to the wrapping div, so that the wrapping div here receives a class name, which is classes auth, this newly added CSS class. If we now save all these files, this is looking pretty good on all device sizes, I guess. So this is my sign up form. The next step is to also configure this form to have validation. So let's do that in the next step. I will also copy the code for this from contact data. And by the way, with all this code copying, you would correctly say, can't we outsource some of this code in some centralized file? And yes, we can. We'll do this in the next module where we will apply some optimizations to this project. For now, I will just grab check validity, this method, copy it, and add it to my auth container too. So above render, I'll add check validity, which supports various rules, actually all the rules I use here. And now I need an input changed handler. And I will also get this from contact data. So to check the validity, I'll add a new method to my auth container. I'll name it input changed handler. And there I expect to get the event and the control name, which did change. And in there, I now can use a lot of the logic, but not all, from the contact data. I want to create an updated form, not named order form though, where I update my elements. but I'll do it manually here in the auth container. So I'll create my updated controls constant, where I will create a new object where I will copy this state controls first. And then I want to only update one of the controls, the control with the control name we have here. So state controls simply copies all elements inside this controls object, and one of them will then be overwritten by me, and that's the one with the name I receive as an argument here. And that should then in turn receive a new object. So here I will then also call this state controls for that given control name and distribute all its properties so that I can then override some of the properties. For example, the value. Now the value of this control, and I can basically now override all the properties we have here on the control, like value and valid and touched. So the value will now be event target value. Valid will use this check validity method, and there I will pass event target value and the rules of this given control. So the rules are this state controls for this control name. There we have this validation property which I'll pass. So that is referring to that validation property each control has where I set up the rules. So that is now what I pass as a second argument to check validity. Additionally, I'll add another property, touched, will be set to true here. Whenever this input change handler fires, the user did type something, so it's definitely touched. So with that, I update my individual control, which was changed. I update all relevant fields I want to change. Now I deliberately won't handle the overall form validity here. I won't check this. I won't disable the submit button for invalid forms, because I also want to show what happens if we submit invalid forms. You can of course implement this too, but I won't. So I'm pretty much done here. What I will have to do is I'll call setState in input changed handler and set the controls property equal to my updated controls now. With that, I got this working. Now I need to connect it. I already did this because I used the same name as in contact data. So this should work. Now let's save this and let's see if validation is working then. Back in the project, if I start typing here, it stays invalid until it's a valid email address. And the password has to be at least 6 characters long to be treated as valid. So that's working. And as I said, the button is deliberately never changed. So my form is finished. My next step is to now handle the submission. And of course, I want to do this using Redux and Action Creators.